Okay, this is Module 4, History and Strategic Process. If you're taking this course in 2014, this is to make up for the snow day that we missed. And as soon as I woke up at 8 o'clock in the morning and saw the snow, I got on the phone and called over here and reserved studio time. I'm sure, dozens of professors called to try to reserve time to make up, to do their lectures for the class that they missed, either on Tuesday or Wednesday. But so this is Module 4. It's history of marketing and kind of history of marketing thought and the strategic process. And this will be on Test 1. And for this semester, if you're taking the class in 2004, even though we missed the snow day, everything is on schedule because we're able to tape this, and they have assured me that they're going to put it up on YouTube. I kind of hate for this to go on YouTube because I'm not going to be able to let them edit it, and then if I mess up or if I get the red eye or something like that, they're not going to be able to cut it and edit it, and I've got to get this done right away, and I may hesitate and stall and be a little bit clumsy in my delivery at times, and if you will forgive me for that. It's better than driving through a snowstorm in the middle of the night, risking your life to go to a marketing class. So anyway, the history of marketing begins at the very earliest times. I mean, the very earliest times. In ancient times, they would talk about how noisy the city was, and there's stories in the Bible about, the marketplace and how the holy sites had become places where vendors hawk their wares, and even in Rome, the city smelled like garlic because so many of the shops would put their garlic sausages outside as an enticement to get people to come inside. Almost as soon as there was excess production, there was marketing. Whenever somebody was able to make or grow or create more of something than they could use themselves, then they had an incentive to barter it or trade it. And that's how marketing started. And as soon as almost from the very beginning of times, and it's fed even today by the human being's insatiable desire. Our desire for material things can never be satiated, and even billionaires want bigger yachts and bigger, faster planes and better this and better that. And there's always a new home on a desert island somewhere that they want. And that's true for most of us. We cannot afford to get, buy everything in a store. And we have to pick and choose, and we have to try to figure out what it is that we're going to do with our money. And it's for people who come from communist systems where there were no goods in the shop. They had plenty of money, but nothing to buy with them. And then you come in a situation where there's plenty of stuff. When capitalism starts, especially the early days of capitalism, because those countries are very poor, there's lots of stuff in the shop, but they have no money to buy them. And the former situation may be a little bit easier on the palate, on the psyche, than the latter situation where, there's lots of stuff, but you can't afford to get it. I'm going to, in the PowerPoint here, I say I'm going to give a 30-minute history lesson. I can't do that, obviously. I'm going to give a 5-minute history lesson. Adam Smith gives a story, and I heard it on PBR the other day, and although I had read Adam Smith's book, he talks about a situation where in his time, ordinary working people from the higher levels of the working class to the middle class to the aristocracy, whenever they went out, they wore a linen shirt. When they went out in public or they went out to do things, they would almost always wear a linen shirt. In the time of the Caesars and the great Roman Empire and all the things that they did, nobody wore linen shirts. Even Caesar and the senators, and none of them could wear linen shirts. So what has happened is that we have gradually accumulated from the very early days until the modern times this store of knowledge. And in the early days, it's knowledge like how to preserve olive oil, which the Philistines, that was their thing. They developed a technique for storing olive oil, and that became almost like a medium of exchange in the biblical era. In Korea, they learned at a very early time how to store food for the winter. They would create the kimchi that's eaten today was originally a way for people to, when the goods and produce and cabbages and radishes and all of that were plentiful in the fall, they would take that and they would put salt in it and some pepper, and they would put some vinegar in there and or some over spoiled rice wine, that version of vinegar, or shikcho in the Korean language, and they would bury that in the ground, and then people had food in the winter when people are hungry, and they would develop that system for preserving food. So many civilizations developed special abilities and were able to create wealth and success through the ability to preserve fish. Even in modern times, the Dutch, that pickled herring, which is a way of preserving pickled fish in a salt solution. If you've ever eaten it today, it's extremely salty. But in medieval times, you read bills of trade and stuff like that, and it was like a medium of exchange. They pay 12,000 jars of pickled herring for this, 800 jars of pickled herring for this, and that was a medium of exchange all over the world. When specie, gold and silver, were hard to come by and hard to carry and hard to trade, that was a medium of exchange. So they were able to do something. They needed to mine, manufacture shoes, leather clothes, shells. The native peoples in this country, wore a lot of ornamental shells and things like that, and that was a form of wealth that was created by the people that grew up, the native peoples that were in the area where I grew up in northern Florida. So those societies developed some ability, some special thing that they could do that was coveted in other places, and then they were able to trade, and then civilizations developed around that. Other societies didn't necessarily become wealthy through some sort of specialized manufacturing or agricultural process, but through trading. And they would go to this country and they would get that special thing that those people made that was rare in other places. And the idea of trading in its basic form is to take something from a place where it's inexpensive and take it to a place where it's dear. And so you take something that's in abundance in one place, salt near the seashore, and take it inland, and then there are things that, herbs and things that grow in the medicinal things that grow in the mountain, ginseng and things like that may grow in the mountain, and then you trade those back and forth. And if you look at and so a lot of civilizations became great just through trading. The Greeks, Romans, Phoenicians, all of these Western civilizations, if you look at where they come from and where the big cities are, they're almost always in a place where there's a port. And, Rome is right up the Tiber River from the Mediterranean Sea. I started to say the ocean, Mediterranean Sea. And London is up the Thames River. The biggest and most successful cities in the United States through most of the early history were New Orleans and New York. New Orleans is right up the Mississippi Delta, where the biggest, largest river. People in this area, even in the middle of Tennessee, if you were in the watershed that goes down to the Tennessee River, a lot of people would grow the main cash crop, which is tobacco, float down the Holston River to the Tennessee River, float down the Tennessee River to the Mississippi River, and go down to New Orleans and sell their tobacco. And then they would, it was the 1840s or so before they could, late 1830s, early 1840s, before they could come up the river, because they could go up the river in boats. And so a lot of the people would walk home. A very tough stock the people who are from this area come from. The big cities of the world, if you look at the big cities, Seoul, Kyoto, and in Japan, Tokyo in Japan, New York, Los Angeles in this country. They're all of the biggest cities in the world are almost all located near navigable waterways that run into the ocean. And in many cases within the tide of the ocean, so that the people can take the tide up the river. Most rivers, as they run to the sea and they get close to the sea, they become tidal. So boats can take the incoming tide from the open ocean up into the port. And so you got a nice, safe place. It's protected from storms and the vagaries of the open ocean, and protected harbors and things like that, where you have deep water and boats and large boats can come in. And so you look at the great cities of the world, and they're almost always in that type of situation. They're on a very large navigable river, usually near where there's a seaport. And the reason for that is that shipping stuff by boat, by water, has always been the cheapest and most efficient way to do it, and it still is even today the most cheapest and most inexpensive way to do it. Now, we reached a point in history where the systems that we use for agriculture became so sophisticated. In Europe, this might have been the widespread use of the iron plow. In countries in Asia, it was methods for cultivating rice, where they would, they have in a lot of parts of Asia, they have a long dry season and then they'll have a monsoon season. And they have to have sophisticated agricultural systems because you have to save the water. They call it literally saving the water from the rainy season and then use that through the rest of the year. So terraced agriculture and damming of rivers and things like that to promote rice production became so successful. Widespread use of the iron plow. With an iron plow, somebody can plow 5 times as much land. So that as agriculture became, with the use of better and better equipment, became so successful that you needed fewer and fewer people to work on the land. They developed a group of people who formed the foundations of the Industrial Revolution. And that group of people we think of today as kind of your urban proletariat. Your kind of factory worker in the cities, people who did not have access to land and who needed to labor. And of course, in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, they would have worked 6 hours a day, 12 hours a day, often in conditions, no health insurance, if they got hurt, there was no workman's comp. If they and they worked in situations where were almost guaranteed to get sick and get the black lung of the coal miners and the other diseases that people would get from working in these very unhealthy conditions. There were massive fires where lots of people died, those people that no longer were needed for agriculture became the foundations of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution started obviously in Europe, in Germany and England, and the most advanced countries, France, are the most advanced countries of Europe, and came to the United States fairly late. I think, if you're following along in the PowerPoint here, I'm starting to introduce the 3 eras of marketing thought. And the first era is the production era, which I date to kind of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the Industrial Revolution came late in this country. In fact, if you look at the War of 1812, the British landed a very small force. I want maybe historians watching, this is on YouTube, and I may not have this right. I want to say around 10,000 men. They marched through the most populous part of the country, meeting almost no resistance. They fought one battle where our troops hastily, kind of militia and inexperienced troops kind of fired one shot and then ran. And they marched into Washington, this small band of men marched into Washington, and they ate sandwiches at the White House, and they burned the White House to the ground. And then they walked down to the Capitol, and they burned the Capitol to the ground, and then they burned most of the federal buildings and generally wreaked havoc before walking back. And they actually lost a lot of soldiers, more soldiers from the terrible conditions. I think a heavy rainstorm hit, and many of the soldiers got sick, and they lost a bunch of soldiers to kind of the conditions, more so than they lost in the battle when they went back to, I guess, the Maryland, the part where they had originally landed in Maryland. Now that's in the 1814 that happened. By 2 generations later, we were the most powerful, and by the 1880s, 1890s, the most powerful industrial country in the world. And we won World War II and World War I and World War II, saved the world twice, and it didn't take nothing away from the brave people who fought in the war. But honestly, it was more Rosie the Riveter, the people that stayed home and worked in the factories. And by the end of World War II, for example, we were building 1,000 planes a week. Can you imagine 1,000 planes, military planes a week? And nobody could touch that. And when I was over in Korea and I was studying the Korean language with a lot of Japanese, and they would talk about the bomb and the Pearl Harbor and stuff like that. And I, said, look, once they attacked Pearl Harbor, there was nothing. No matter what was, if you'd have won a couple more battles here or there, it wouldn't have made any difference. Once Pearl Harbor was attacked, the only thing that would end up would be that every building in Japan had been bombed to the ground, and a total surrender. There was no other choice because they couldn't keep up with us industrially, and that happened just in the space of several generations. And I think your management people probably have talked about how this happened and what happened. But I'm going to start the 3 eras of marketing thought, what I call the production era. And the production era is a time when the dominant business philosophy of the era was to minimize average total cost. So the focus was on minimizing the cost of production. And I have some equations there, and I would go through them in class and everything, where you take total cost, you think it's total cost is fixed cost, variable cost, and then if you do some algebraic transformations, you get down to average total cost being fixed cost divided by X plus variable cost divided by X. Now the fixed cost are those costs that are not tied to the level of production. Your mortgage on the building, the land, equipment cost, research and development, sunk cost on research and development, labor that cannot be terminated during a slow period. In other words, all your overhead, the overhead of labor. Now, what is fixed cost and what is variable cost depends on your time frame. In a really long-term perspective, let's say we're developing a 30-year plan, almost all of the cost may be variable cost. But in the short run, over, say, a 1-year, 2-year period, what is a fixed cost and what is a variable cost, I put there in the PowerPoint. Anything that's not tied to the level of production, whereas is fixed cost. And variable costs are the costs that vary per unit of production, labor cost and components of production, all the components that actually go into the production process. And so if your focus in the production era was on minimizing average total cost, then how did you do that? And the easiest way, if you think about it, is first of all, you spread out the fixed cost among as many units as possible. The first high-definition television set I saw, for example, was at a trade show in Kingsport. I want to say it was Magnavox, $30,000. They weren't really trying to sell it. It was just a demonstration kind of thing. $30,000 for this television. The first ones we had in this area, I think there was a place called Frogs. It was a audio store, and there's a Wells Camera Shop, which hopefully very nice people are still around in Kingsport. And they both had high definition television sets, and I want to say that $8,000 to $10,000 were the first ones that I saw. They're really heavy. If you put them, you had to be careful. You may have had to, prop up the floor or go in and reinforce the floor to spread out the weight because they were so heavy. And of course, the picture quality wasn't anything near what we have now with our liquid crystal displays and things like that, the flat screens. And they were huge and they were heavy and they cost a fortune. And certain people would buy them. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the class, the type of person that goes out and rushes out and buys the newest gadgets and the newest thing in any particular product class. We call them consumer innovators. So you spread out the fixed costs among as many units as possible, and that means getting production up. If you think about the fixed cost per unit, the reason that first Magnavox cost $30,000 was that they had spent millions and millions of dollars in development, and they'd only made a few hundred of these things. So in order to, if you spread it, think that the fixed cost per unit was huge. And the only way to get the fixed cost per unit down is to make a lot. So specialization, the next way, specialization by function and production. And I talk a bit later about, standards, and then standardize to minimize component cost, production costs, and R&D. And the man who epitomizes that, now please don't say on the test that Henry Ford is the person that brought the person that developed production era thinking, or the first person to build a factory, or the person that was the founder of the Industrial Revolution. That's not true. I mean, the Industrial Revolution in the United States happened a century and a half after it started in Europe. And Henry Ford, there were three, they had factories like this in Europe long before Henry Ford came along. But if you think about how Henry Ford did it, he had, if you spread out the fixed costs among as many units as possible, he was creating large numbers of product for the first time. The Model T, when it first rolled off and sometimes I get the Model T and the Model A backwards. I want to say this: the Model T, 1908, first rolled off the assembly line. The specialization of function and production, everybody did one thing. All this stuff now with teamwork and burnout, and you don't do the same thing all the time. You kind of rotate around in a team and do different things. They didn't do any of that. If you were the guy that put the oil filter on back in that era, the thing came down the assembly line, you grabbed the oil filter, put a little oil in the threads, you turned it until it was tight, took that filter wrench and gave it that 1.5 more turns, not overturning it, not over tight, but tight enough. And that you might, somebody might have worked in a Henry Ford factory making Henry Ford cars for 30 or 40, 50 years, and that might have been their job the whole time. I mean, they might have never done anything different. Every day they sat there all day putting oil filters on. That's what they did. So specialization by function, and that's the old assembly line. Instead of one person making an entire car, each person does one part of the car. Each entity, each stop along the way, there's a team now that does one particular thing. And standardization of product. The old joke was you get a Model T in any color you want as long as you wanted black. They didn't have a lot of options. They didn't have a lot of different model numbers and model names and things like that. But when that car rolled off of the assembly line, the average family, working family that made an average income, it was about $500 in 1908. And I don't know exactly what that would be today, but it was a price at which ordinary people who had ordinary jobs, not the intelligentsia, not the young bond, not the aristocrats, but the just kind of ordinary people could afford. And at least one car in the garage. They put one car in the garage. And that's the production era, where everybody was focused. When they had meetings and things, what can we do to make more money, or what can we do to be more successful as a business? The answer was minimize cost. What can we do to minimize cost? And that's where all the thinking, and they build the factory close to the railroad, build the factory close to the port, have things shipped in a more efficient manner. Buy bigger bulk units of production. All of those minimize average total cost, all that minimize average total cost thinking. And marketing really wasn't very heavily involved at that time. There were some famous companies, your Coca-Colas and some other companies, that were doing marketing, and there were advertisements in every newspaper and every magazine. And it's not a new concept, advertising, but there wasn't a lot of marketing, was not at the forefront of business thinking and business philosophy during the production era. Now, the sales era, is the next era. If the production era was the era in which companies sought to minimize average total cost, and everything was focused on make it cheaper, make it cheaper, make it cheaper, there all of a sudden came a time when everything was being made cheap. And I'll date the Industrial Revolution here really started after in the late 1860s, after the Civil War, and then through the First World War. And the sales era, different books will date it differently, but I date the sales era from the period after World War I, which would be, starting in the 1920s. I know World War I ended in 1918. But starting in the 20s and continuing up until the mid-50s. Then that would be the sales era. Now, many books don't date it that way. They date it to the end of from the end of World War I to World War II. But I date it a little bit differently, and I'll explain that in a minute. So the sales era, the dominant business philosophy of the time, the dominant marketing philosophy of the time was the way to reach that perfect corporate place, which on the PowerPoint I call corporate nirvana, was through personal selling excellence. And that was the way and there came a time, the reason for the impetus for the coming of the sales era was we reached a point at which mass production was already being used by everybody. After World War I, by the period after World War I to the modern day, anything that's not mass-produced, it's like a big deal. They've got places in our area here in Tennessee, for those of y'all that are watching in other places, where people still handmade quilts. It's a big deal. It's handmade. It's a big deal when something is handmade anymore in the modern era, because everything is made by machines, and it became harder and harder and harder to squeeze more and more and more profit out of merely reducing costs. That just wasn't working. In the sales era, the attitude of the marketing attitude was here's the product. We've done a great job, and they would go to the sales. We've done a great job making the product. We made it about as cheaply as can possibly be made. The problem is that we need to get it out there for the consumer. And unlike early periods, when in the pre-World War I, when people went to the store, they bought nails and they bought butter and they bought milk. They didn't go and they didn't buy Mayfield dairy milk, and they didn't buy Land O'Lakes butter. They bought butter and milk. Well, when there are more choices in the stores, as people started moving to the cities, in this period it was really more of a period when people moved into small towns. Fewer and fewer people were being needed in agriculture, and more people lived in small towns. And there were a lot of small retailers, and the retailers could offer them some choices. Distribution was very indirect in this period. The modern milieu of retailing is the chain era. Almost every store we go to is part of a corporate chain. It's really unusual if it's not part of a chain. Every store in the mall, every store in the trails, almost every store is not a mom and pop operation, but part of a chain operation. In the sales era, though, in the period after World War I, most of the stores were owned by small mom and pops. Now, some small mom and pops like the Woolworths and the people like that became hugely successful and built chains out of it. Later on, people like Sam Walton would come along and blow them out of the water with his new ideas. But the attitude was, here, we got the products, you go sell. So marketing was not involved in like doing a lot of marketing, going and telling them, listen, our customers tell us we don't need this, this type of widget, or we need a widget that does this, or we need a flashlight that can be twisted and turned and set up, and we need this and we need that. They were not doing that. The companies made the products. The salesman's job was to sell the products. They didn't write sales reports, and we didn't have a lot of marketing research in this era about what it was that people actually wanted from their products. So then the sales era, the distribution was indirect, and every time, I think if this is the key point of the thinking of marketing people in the sales era, when sales were down, or sales were not as high as we want them to be, or sales could be really great, or we need to increase profits by 10%, or whatever we need to do to make us better, the answer always seemed to be something involving sales. Let's have a period where let's have some contests for our salespeople, where the top salesperson in each district wins a free car, or or gets a free trip to Miami, or to Sopchoppy, some great tourist destination. And so that was the solution. The solution may have been to hire more salespeople, or to change the incentive structure for salespeople so that they got more commission and less salary to make them really hustle. Or maybe it was to pressure the sales managers, to pressure the salespeople, go out there and sell, 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 go team, go, sell, sell, sell. But the solution had to do with pushing the product down through the channel and ultimately to the consumer. And that was the solution in the sales era. Now, the marketing era is the era of the ascendancy of the consumer. When you read a marketing textbook, they can never leave it at this. They always say, well, we're now in some new era, societal marketing era, where companies care more about society than they do selling products. No, we're really still in the marketing era. Now, the marketing era may change, and people 20 years from now may date the advent of social media. The internet was important, but the internet wasn't nearly as important as all this social media stuff from a marketing standpoint. This is the era of digital marketing and using social media for branding and promotion of the product more so than the old traditional advertising things, although you would never know that by all the hype and hoopla about the Super Bowl that's going on tonight, that's going on right now. And when I say hype and hoopla about the Super Bowl, and I don't mean about the Super Bowl game, y'all know, because my students know this, I'm about the hype and hoopla over the Super Bowl ads. $4 million a 30-second slot. Now, on the test question, I'll have you'll have to know, if I ask you, you'll need to know the transition. So if I ask you about the sales area, you'll need to know why we transitioned out of the production era into the sales era. And if I ask you about the marketing, you have to know why we transitioned out of the marketing era for the sales era. And that's the impetus for the coming of the marketing era. In the decade after World War II, consumers had lots of product choices and the affluence to take advantage of them. Consumers were concentrating in larger metropolitan areas where there was more competition among retailers. And consumers had cars. Now, when I say consumers have cars, in this era, this was an era when men worked and most women who were married stayed home. And the person who was the consumer in this era, and honestly it's still the main consumer today of most of the stuff that products that are being sold, were women. So when I say consumers had cars in the PowerPoint, I really mean women had cars. When women have cars, now all of a sudden when they go shopping for groceries, they go shopping for clothes, they no longer have to ride the bus home or carry big bags full of groceries on the bus or on the subway or whatever and carry all that home. When you don't have a car, and my brother lived in Chicago without a car, people shop locally. I mean, they went, being close. Being close was a lot more important, really, than saving a couple dollars here and there. Or this brand new store that opened has brands of ice cream or brands of milk that are better, or special types of cheeses or other products that the other stores don't have. So we'll go over there. But when women have cars, they can look around. They can look around. There's the opportunity for the retailer that does the best job at finding out what she wants and having that stuff in the store is going to get her business. So the concentrating of more in metropolitan areas means more retailers. The fact that there's more retailers and then you give consumers car, all of a sudden the word choice comes in. And the ability, it's nothing to drive on the other side of town to go shopping. Women in particular, a lot of times they don't want to shop too close. And some of y'all, that's why wherever women who live in Atlanta always want to go to New York to shop, and women who live in Tallahassee want to go to Atlanta to shop, and because they like to, I don't know, the feeling that there's better stuff in these large cities that are far away. But so those are the impetus for the coming of the marketing era. The marketing era philosophy. Now, for this, if the previous philosophy production era was minimize average total cost, for sales era, let's have personal selling excellence. Let's have the best sales team, the most aggressive, the strongest, the hardest working sales force. In the marketing era, became that path to corporate nirvana is by satisfying consumer needs. You must satisfy consumer needs. The era of the ascendancy of the consumer. And the way to reach that perfect corporate place, that corporate nirvana, the place where profits are up, sales are up, same store sales are up, new stores are opening, there's promotion opportunities for employees, the investors in the company, the stockholders are happy because earnings are growing. That perfect corporate place can best be reached by figuring out how to satisfy consumer needs. Now, if you think about the manifestations or what became apparent or what happened because of the coming of the marketing era, myriad choices for consumers, many choices. Myriad is a kind of word that came into English from Greek. It means large in number and diverse in nature. Manipulation of needs through advertising. The professor who taught me advertising would flinch every time I use the word manipulate needs. But that's the truth. Honestly, a lot of people in Eastern Europe, they never heard of gingivitis. Didn't realize they needed to have white teeth. Nobody had perfect teeth in a lot of those countries. They couldn't. An era when virtually every kid in middle school, elementary and middle school, has to have braces to straighten their teeth. It didn't happen in those countries, and nobody realized that they needed to use a particular type of toothbrush. The dandruff shampoo, and all of a sudden, I just cannot remember Procter & Gamble's, and this is why I need an editor, Procter & Gamble's dandruff shampoo that was a huge hit in China. People in China, didn't really worry about dandruff. Nobody had heard of dandruff. They didn't even have a word for it, really. And nobody had heard of it. And then now all of a sudden, and so that Procter & Gamble's dandruff shampoo, which I just cannot remember the name of, became a big hit in China, even though it cost 3 times as much as kind of the state manufacturer. Became among the biggest market shares because they were very successful in educating people that dandruff was a horrible thing, and that the members of the opposite sex would think less of you, and your friends would think much less of you if they saw dandruff in your hair or on your clothes. And to me, a lot of it is advertising. Some advertising is to educate and inform the consumer. Okay, that's what the textbooks say. But manipulation of needs. People had needs they never realized that they had, for bigger and better houses, bigger and better cars, better mouthwash, better toothbrushes, better dandruff shampoos. All these issues that they may are kind of only came up because of the brilliance of the advertisers, the people who are portrayed, they're not the real people, obviously, but the people who are portrayed in the show Mad Men were the one, in the 60s when television viewing and 63 and 64 with the big the switch over to color television, and all of that came into being. Marketing involvement, the conception of planning, products, product innovation. Now, marketing did not get involved in production thinking in either the sales or the production era. Now, marketing people are involved from the very beginning because the marketing people do marketing research to see what it is people want. And in business-to-business markets is particularly important because most new ideas come from customers. Research into consumer wants and needs. If you want to know what it is that people want, you want to know if you're trying to satisfy consumers, you have to know about them. And so marketing research came into its own. Became the thing that it is in this era, and we still, in this country, are the best in the world at marketing research. We may not be at the best in the world at stuff related to the internet. There are a lot of countries that are way ahead of us in terms of their, some of the digital revolution, and social media was at the point that it is here, was at that point in 2005, 2006, when I was in Korea, and it seemed to be even more advanced in Japan, although I can't speak and read Japanese, so I hesitate there, but I did have a lot of Japanese friends that would talk about social media and the things that were going on, and I was very hungry to get answers to those types of things. So that is That's the era really that we're still in, where businesses are trying to satisfy consumer needs, and they're trying to do it through research and then developing and making products that from the very beginning stages of development they're trying to figure out, is this really what the consumer wants? In cars, it may be cup holders. Somebody realized a few years ago that people wanted cup holders. People stop off at Starbucks, or they go and get a big gulp at the convenience store, and they like to carry a drink around with them. And even kids need one. And so they put, the big thing in engineering for a period of 5 to 10 years was create better, more sophisticated cup holders. Now, of course, they made changes and everything in the car, but that's if the marketing people aren't involved, that's a change that doesn't get made, because engineers would not make cup holders or think of cup holders as important until the marketing people do marketing research and tell people that's what matters. That's what makes a big difference. And I can remember one car that I bought about 10 years ago. My wife saw the cup holder and said, "This is what you need. You got to have this car." The cup holder was perfect, in the perfect spot, and it would hold a big cup or a small cup. It was really ingeniously designed, and she said, "This is the car for you." Cup holders. History of marketing. So that's the history of marketing, and I want to work out in the next set of this module a kind of working definition of marketing strategy, and talk a little bit about planning and development and the strategic process. Sorry about that. I should have turned my phone off before I came in here. So the definition that comes out of the textbook: managerial process, develop, maintaining a variable fit between the organization's objective, skills, and the resources on the one hand, and its changing marketing opportunities on the other. Now, my definition, practical definition, is a dynamic assessment of dynamic meaning ever-changing, ever-developing, ever-developing, and being improved, continually improved. Dynamic assessment of target markets, market segments, and then the development of the appropriate marketing mix. Marketing strategy, a product strategy, a pricing strategy, a distribution or place strategy, and then finally a promotion strategy, and which we now call integrated marketing communication strategy, involving all the various aspects: advertising, public relations, sales promotion, personal selling, all of that kind of being combined, and direct marketing, all that being combined together. So that's the kind of working definition of strategy. And in the MBA program, y'all have had a lot of corporate and division level strategic planning. Y'all have had a lot of that. And so I don't want to go back over that. In fact, we used to teach the GE Screen and the Boston Consulting Group matrix. The based on market share and then how with dominant market share, and then how fast the was growing. So if you had that was the cash cows, the dogs, the question marks, and the stars. And if you had, for example, you had an SBU, you had an area of your business that was in a fast-growing market and it had the dominant market share, then that would be a star. If you had something that was a slow-growing market and it had a dominant market share, one of the companies that had a dominant market share, then it would be a cash cow. And a dog, which is was something that where you had low market share, or maybe you were a niche marketer in a slow-growing field, and not a lot of opportunity for improvement. The marketing type of decision and marketing planning and marketing strategy is normally done at the strategic business unit level. And you've talked about strategic business units before. And some companies may have several hundred. Your large companies, I think Weyerhaeuser, there was one study of Weyerhaeuser, which is a forest products company, which I think has since merged, but they had like 104 strategic business units. And it's at the strategic business unit level that's done. And you've had this before, but I think the key thing is that a strategic business unit is kind of its own responsibility. Its own set of planning. It has its own either manager, it's called a president of that unit, or the vice president in charge of that division, or that SBU. It has it's like a single business. It has its own set of competitors, does its own set of plans, and that's the level at which marketing strategy is usually done. And if you were in a job interview and somebody said to you, "What is marketing? Explain to me the key aspects of marketing in 50 words or less, in 30 seconds or less." And I would say this: it's determining what target market you want, and then developing the marketing strategy: price, place, promotion, physical distribution strategy, product strategy. I'm never going to agree to do something without it being edited again. Strategy that fits each target market, and that's it. And that's the strategic process. The way that it works in practice is that you have a situational analysis when you're starting off the planning process and developing a strategic plan, is that you normally have a situational analysis. Well, y'all have learned probably SWOT analysis, strengths and weaknesses, that's kind of an internal thing. Opportunities and threats, that's an external thing. So those, you go and you assess for each SBU or each business entity, what are its advantages, how can that be fully exploited or leveraged, what are the disadvantages, what are the threats, where are the opportunities. And then you set goals or targets for what you want to do. And it may be an increase in market share. It may be that you want to keep sales the same in a tough times, keep sales the same, not lose any sales, but increase profits through cutting off not the top line, but one of the working on the middle lines that lead to the bottom line, and not worrying about the top line, the revenue. The basic, and so then you have that, and then there's a plan that's put together. 5 years seems to be typical in this country of long-run plans. I was very impressed, and I said so when I was on the national TV there, the national English language, I guess it's the international, broadcast in many countries from Korea. And they had me on, and I said, they had just announced in Korea, Samsung had just announced in Korea that they were going to invest $22 billion over the next 30 years in research and development. They were going to invest, and they had figured out the figure to the dollar, and over 20 years. So it was either 20-year or 30. I want to say maybe 20-year plan. 20-year plan, but it was a really long-term plan. And they had set aside a huge amount of money, and then they had also, were going to staff the entity that was going to supervise the research with the people that could get that job done. And so in this country, a long-term plan is normally 5 years. But be aware that, and you've heard from your management professors, the big weakness in American business philosophy and the American business way of doing things the last several decades has been the too much short-run focus. I mean, there's too much. What are our profits going to be this quarter? Are we going to make our number? Are we going to make our number this quarter? If we don't, maybe we, like Enron, they kind of manufactured it out of thin air a few times. And what can we do to make our number in this quarter? And instead of worrying about the long term. And I think the businesses that you see that are really successful have had more of a long-term focus and have been, they don't worry necessarily about next quarter's profits. It's what's going to happen over the next few years that really matters. So you develop this strategic plan. Now, in the process of implementation, which is the next step, a lot of times you can have a great plan, but it's the implementation. If you listen to a football coach explain, why they lost a game, it was always never the plan; it was always the execution. And if they ask them why they won a game, we executed, and they never say, "Well, we had a better plan," or "We outplanned or outprepared." For the other team. And you'll see some games when Alabama beat Notre Dame that, for the championship a year ago. It was clear they'd outplanned Notre Dame. But most of the time it's execution. And a lot of times whether a strategic marketing plan is successful or not depends on implementation. And there's several different reasons for implementation failure. You can not give enough information to the people. I think sometimes when you're putting a plan together, it's easier to get the plan approved if you don't have too much information. If you leave a lot of stuff to doubt, and just say, well, let's worry about the details later. But then when the implementers have to figure out what they're supposed to do, they don't have enough direction because the other thing is that a lot of times the not enough resources given for implementation. When we had our program review, I better not say this. Never mind. I won't say that. I was going to talk about our new master's program in digital marketing. Well, maybe I will. I will go ahead and say it. I might get in trouble, but I'll go ahead and say it. But when we had a program review, we have a new master's program in digital marketing, Master of Science in Digital Marketing. And the people that came to review, especially the outside reviewers, said, you don't have enough resources allocated for implementation. And she was right. That we don't have enough resources allocated for implementation, and that's a very common thing. In that make the plan and okay, it's going to work itself out. Well, there's got to be resources given to implementers. If they're supposed to do certain things, they have to be given the resources to do it. And that's the other reason for implementation failure. Is that the third reason? The last reason I'm going to talk about. The third reason is that the environmental conditions, the business environment changes. I mean, you can have a great plan. You could have had a great plan in 2007 to buy a piece of property, go in, put streets in, get the underground utilities put in, build spec homes and all that, over the next couple years, and it would have been a huge failure. Because real estate prices plummeted in some places by more than 50% on average. That's a huge figure if you think about it. The average house in a particular community losing more than 50% of its value, very, very huge. So no amount of great planning and everything would have made that venture successful just because the environmental conditions changed. Legal environment could change. The political environment could change. There could be some new law or regulation that makes it very difficult in healthcare. Every little new change in the way insurance works has to be watched very, very carefully, and the person who is the hero in every medical office, every medical business in the country is the person that gets the insurance approvals. And that's the most valuable. That's the most valuable player. Like if your most valuable player for most football teams is your striker. The central defender, every now and then I guess maybe the goalie or your one of your central defenders may become the most valuable player, but generally it's the striker because the striker scores the goals, and the most valuable player in a medical office is the person that gets the insurance approval, and that's because the conditions change. Now finally, that's the implementation, the reason for implementation failure. Finally, control and feedback. Now, the feedback mechanisms need to be there to make sure that something doesn't work. And I've talked about this before, but there's one fast food restaurant. It's an old chain. It's been around for a long time, and it's right across the street from the university. And I talk about it in class a little bit in my lectures. I'm not going to say the name, but there's something wrong with their control feedback mechanisms. Every time you go over there could be nobody there, and you drive up and say, "Can you wait a minute, please?" Wait for what? I mean, you haven't had a customer in like 20 minutes, and the customer drives up, and you tell them to wait. And then sometimes they forget about you. And I have many, many stories from my undergraduates who have to talk about, these service quality, and they have these, we have discussion boards, or we have discussion in class, and that particular restaurant, part of a major restaurant chain well known in the country. In this area, there are several restaurants, maybe a single franchise owner or something, but their control and feedback mechanisms is way out of whack. And just like in a manufacturing process, you have a statistical process control. You have gunpowder, and somebody takes a random sample of each batch of gunpowder and runs it through several tests, and puts it in test tubes and puts the litmus paper in there, and the litmus paper is supposed to turn yellow, and if it turns red, there's something really bad. There's a very big problem, and as long as it's yellow the way it's supposed to be, it's not red and it's not blue, and everything's good, and the process is in control. Well, in marketing, we have more of an issue of control, because a lot of the things that are done, you can't run a chemical test to make sure the statistical process is in control. You don't have valves and gauges. A gauge that shows the temperature all of a sudden overheats, and we got, Houston, we have a problem. There's none of that. They don't have that in marketing. Things can get out of control, and nobody does anything about it, like that restaurant across the street that all of y'all know about, and if we've talked about in class, or will talk about in class, at least in 2014, because we've been snowed out and haven't had but one class. So, but in a retailing situation, the statistical process control would be mystery shoppers, surprise visits by the higher level managers, customer surveys, where the customers can take their receipt and go online and do a survey about the quality of service that they receive, and that type of control feedback. And also for marketing, even if we're in advertising or something like that, is the company getting the results? If a company's spending money with us to advertise their product, we want them to be successful. Because in the long run, demand for promotion, advertising, and other types of paid media is based on whether the company that's buying the stuff actually is successful. And we may be able to talk somebody into buying an ad that's not really going to help them. But in the long run, in business, you make more money by being a good partner to the people that are your clients and your business partners. And you help them, you make money by helping them make money. You don't make money by, conning them into doing something that's not successful. So control and feedback is the key, the final piece of the puzzle to make sure that the marketing process, service quality, customer value perceptions, all product quality, all of those things are under control. Okay, that is Module 4.